The champagne glasses sparkled under the crystal chandeliers as another wave of laughter swept through the grand ballroom. It was one of those fancy charity events where people wore clothes that cost more than most folks made in a month. The kind of party where everyone smiled perfectly and talked about things that didn't really matter. Robert Harrison stood near the center of it all, a glass of expensive wine in his hand that he hadn't actually drunk from. He was 42, successful beyond what most people could imagine, and according to every magazine that wrote about him, one of the most eligible bachelors in the country. His company had revolutionized online security, and the money that followed had bought him almost everything. Almost. He glanced around the room at the faces of people he barely knew, all of them here because his assistant had sent invitations to a charity gala at his Connecticut estate. They were good people, probably. They wrote checks for good causes. But standing there, Robert felt the familiar emptiness that had settled into his bones 5 years ago when his marriage fell apart. Not that anyone here knew that. They only saw the successful businessman who seemed to have it all figured out. His eyes landed on the piano sitting silent in the corner of the ballroom. It was a beautiful instrument over 100 years old with ivory keys that had been played by some famous composer, whose name Robert could never quite remember. He'd bought it at an auction 3 years ago because it seemed like the kind of thing a mansion should have, but the truth was it mostly just sat there looking expensive. "Robert, you really outdid yourself this time," one of his business partners said, slapping him on the shoulder. "This place is incredible. Though I have to ask, does anyone actually play that piano, or is it just for show?" Robert smiled, the same smile he gave in every business meeting. "You know, I don't think anyone's touched it since I bought it. Real shame, isn't it? I always thought it would be romantic if someone could actually make it sing. Maybe I should have put that in the invitation. If you can play this piano, I'll marry you on the spot." The group around him erupted in laughter. Someone made a joke about his famous bachelor status. Another person said something about mail-order piano teachers. Robert laughed along with them, but the joke felt hollow even as he said it. Everything felt hollow lately. What Robert didn't notice was the man in the simple black uniform standing near the catering table about 20 feet away. The man who'd been refilling water pitchers and making sure the food stations stayed neat. The man who'd become so good at being invisible that guests walked past him without a second glance. David Park was 38 years old, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. He'd been working as the head caretaker of the Harrison estate for 3 years now. It was a good job, steady and quiet. He kept the gardens maintained, made sure the pool was clean, fixed things when they broke, and helped coordinate events like this one. The pay was decent, he had a small cottage on the property, and most importantly, nobody asked him questions about his past. He'd been checking that the champagne bottles were properly chilled when he heard Robert make that joke about the piano. Something in his chest tightened. His hands froze on the ice bucket, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The piano, that gorgeous instrument sitting untouched in the corner. David had walked past it hundreds of times over the past 3 years. He'd dusted it, polished it, made sure it was tuned twice a year even though nobody played it, and every single time he'd kept his hands carefully away from the keys, because David knew what would happen if he touched them. The memories would come flooding back, and he'd worked too hard to keep them buried. He forced himself to look away from the piano and focus on his work. There were guests who needed drinks, plates that needed clearing. He moved through the ballroom like a shadow, doing his job, staying invisible. That's what he was good at now, staying invisible. But his eyes kept drifting back to that piano, and his fingers kept remembering things he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The party continued for hours. David worked steadily, efficiently, the way he always did. He listened to the conversations without really hearing them. Rich people talking about their vacation homes and their stock portfolios and their children's private schools. It was like listening to people speak a language he used to understand but had somehow forgotten. Finally, around midnight, the last guests started leaving. Robert stood at the front entrance, shaking hands and accepting compliments about the wonderful evening. David and the other staff began the cleanup. Plates stacked, linens gathered, chairs pushed back into place. The catering company packed up their equipment and left. The other staff members finished their tasks and headed home. By 1 in the morning, the mansion was quiet. David did his final walkthrough, making sure all the doors were locked, all the lights turned off. All except the ballroom. He always saved that for last. He stood in the doorway looking at the piano. The moonlight came through the tall windows, making the polished wood gleam. It looked lonely somehow, sitting there in that huge empty room. A beautiful instrument that nobody played. A voice that nobody heard. David told himself to turn off the lights and go home. To go back to his cottage, go to sleep, wake up tomorrow, and do his job like he always did. But his feet carried him across the ballroom floor instead. One step, then another, until he was standing right in front of the piano. His hands were shaking. He told himself he was just going to close the lid properly, make sure it was protected. That's all. Just doing his job. But then his fingers touched the keys. Just one note at first, then another. And then, before he could stop himself, before he could remember all the reasons why this was a terrible idea, David began to play. The music poured out of him like water from a broken dam. 20 years of silence, 20 years of grief and guilt and carefully maintained distance, all of it dissolving as his hands remembered what they were made to do. The notes filled the empty ballroom, echoing off the high ceilings, and David closed his eyes and let himself remember. He remembered who he used to be, before everything fell apart. Before he learned that sometimes the price of loving something is losing everything. 20 years ago, David Park was a completely different person. He wasn't a caretaker who tried to stay invisible. He was someone people traveled across the country to see. Someone whose name appeared in newspapers and music magazines. Someone with a future so bright it almost hurt to look at. He was 18 when he won the national piano competition, the youngest winner in the competition's history. The judges called him extraordinary. One of them said he played like he was having a conversation with the piano, like the instrument was alive under his fingers. After that night, everything changed. Suddenly, there were offers from the best music schools in the country. Scholarships, invitations to perform. His parents cried happy tears. His teachers said they always knew he was special. David felt like he was floating, like his whole life had been leading to this moment. He chose the most prestigious music school, moved across the country, and threw himself into his studies. The practice rooms became his second home, sometimes his first home. He'd play for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. His fingers would ache and his back would hurt, but he didn't care. This was what he was meant to do. At 20, he performed at one of the most famous concert halls in America. People paid hundreds of dollars for tickets. They gave him a standing ovation that lasted so long he had to come back out 3 times. A critic wrote that listening to him play was like watching someone paint with sound. David remembered reading that review and thinking his life couldn't get any better. Then he met Lisa. She was a violinist, small and fierce, with dark eyes that seemed to see right through him. They met at a rehearsal for a chamber music performance. She played with the same passion he did, the same complete devotion to the music. They understood each other in a way that didn't need words. They got married 2 years later in a small ceremony with just family and close friends. His parents worried they were too young, but David knew. When you found someone who understood the most important part of you, you didn't let them go. Lisa got pregnant a year after the wedding. They were both terrified and thrilled. David was 24, starting to build a real career. He'd signed with a management company. There were tours being planned, recordings scheduled, but none of that mattered as much as the tiny heartbeat they heard at the doctor's office. They had a daughter, Sophie. She had Lisa's dark eyes and his nose, and when she was born, David held her and understood for the first time what people meant when they said love could break your heart wide open. Life was chaotic with a newborn and 2 demanding careers, but they made it work. Lisa's mother moved in to help. They took turns with night feedings and diaper changes. David would practice while holding Sophie against his chest, and she'd fall asleep to the sound of the piano. Lisa joked that their daughter would grow up thinking music was a lullaby. David was 25 when everything ended. It was a Tuesday in October. The weather was cold, the first real cold snap of the season. Lisa had taken Sophie to a doctor's appointment, just a routine checkup. David was supposed to go with them, but he had a rehearsal he couldn't miss. He remembered kissing them both goodbye that morning. Remembered Sophie's little hand grabbing his finger. Remembered telling Lisa he'd see them for dinner. The phone call came 3 hours later. There'd been an accident. A truck driver fell asleep at the wheel and crossed into oncoming traffic. Lisa's car didn't stand a chance. She died instantly, they told him. Sophie died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The doctor said she probably didn't suffer. David didn't know if they were telling the truth or just being kind. He was in the passenger seat of a friend's car when the second vehicle hit them. A distracted driver running a red light. David woke up in the hospital 2 days later with a fractured skull, 3 broken ribs, and severe nerve damage in his left hand. The physical pain was nothing compared to the other kind. They buried Lisa and Sophie together. David stood at the funeral unable to cry, unable to feel anything except a vast, empty numbness. People spoke to him. He didn't hear them. His parents tried to help. He couldn't look at them. Everything felt like it was happening to someone else, like he was watching his life from very far away. The doctors said the nerve damage in his hand would heal mostly. With physical therapy and time, he'd regain about 80% function. Enough to do most things. Probably not enough to perform professionally. The precision required for concert piano demanded perfection, and his left hand would always have a slight tremor now, a weakness in the 4th and 5th fingers. David didn't care about the physical therapy. He didn't care about anything. He stayed in his apartment for months, barely eating, barely sleeping. His management company called. His teacher called. Friends called. He didn't answer. What was there to say? The person they knew didn't exist anymore. Eventually, he had to make a choice. He could stay in that apartment surrounded by memories of Lisa and Sophie, or he could leave. He couldn't teach music because sitting in a practice room made him want to scream. He couldn't perform because his hand wouldn't cooperate and his heart wasn't in it anyway. He couldn't do anything connected to the life he'd had before. So he ran. He moved to a different state. Changed his phone number. Stopped answering emails. The music world forgot about him eventually. Child prodigy turned tragic story. Another cautionary tale about how quickly life could fall apart. He became a footnote in articles about other young musicians. Whatever happened to that pianist, people would occasionally wonder. Then they'd move on. David took jobs that didn't require thinking. Construction work, warehouse loading, restaurant kitchens. Anything where he could show up, do the work, go home, and not have to be anyone. Not have to feel anything. He didn't touch a piano for 13 years. Couldn't even walk past music stores without his chest tightening. The sound of classical music on the radio made him physically ill. He built a life that had nothing to do with who he used to be, and he told himself it was enough. It had to be enough, because going back to that world meant remembering everything he'd lost, and he wasn't strong enough for that. Until tonight. Until he heard that man joke about marrying someone who could play the piano. Until something in him cracked open and all those carefully buried memories came flooding back. Now here he stood in an empty ballroom at 1 a.m, his hands on piano keys for the first time in over a decade, tears streaming down his face as muscle memory took over, and his fingers remembered what his heart had tried so hard to forget. The music filled every corner of the ballroom. David's fingers moved across the keys like they'd been waiting 13 years for this moment. He was playing something difficult, something most pianists spent months learning, but his hands knew it by heart. They'd always known it. He didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway, didn't hear someone stop outside the ballroom door. He was lost in the music, lost in memories of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. His left hand trembled slightly on the harder passages, the nerve damage making itself known, but he adjusted without thinking. The music was different now, not perfect, but somehow more real, more human. Robert had been in his study going over quarterly reports when he heard it. At first, he thought someone had left music playing on a speaker somewhere. But the sound was too rich, too alive. It was coming from the ballroom. He walked down the hallway, following the sound, and with each step he felt something shift in his chest. He'd heard piano music before, of course. At concerts, on recordings, background music at restaurants. But this was different. This music had weight to it. Emotion that felt almost too private to witness. He reached the ballroom doorway and stopped. The caretaker, David, sat at the piano. His eyes were closed, tears streaming down his face, completely unaware that anyone was watching. His whole body moved with the music, like he and the piano were connected by something deeper than just sound. Robert stood frozen. He'd employed this man for 3 years. David was quiet, efficient, never caused problems, always polite but distant, like he was constantly keeping the world at arm's length. Robert had assumed he was just a private person. He'd never imagined this. The piece built to a climax, the notes cascading through the room like a waterfall. Then it softened, becoming almost gentle like a lullaby. When the final notes faded into silence, David sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the keys, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Robert didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to quietly leave, to pretend he hadn't seen this private moment, but his feet wouldn't move. He stood there in the doorway, his own eyes wet, feeling like he'd just witnessed something sacred. David finally opened his eyes. He looked down at his hands on the keys like he didn't quite recognize them. Then he sensed the presence behind him and turned around quickly, his face going pale when he saw Robert standing there. "I'm sorry," David said immediately, standing up and backing away from the piano. "I shouldn't have. I was just checking the room and I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "Don't apologize," Robert said quietly. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "That was incredible. Where did you learn to play like that?" David looked trapped. He glanced at the door, clearly calculating if he could just leave, but Robert was blocking the exit. "It was a long time ago. I should go. I have to finish locking up." "Wait." Robert stepped into the room. "Please, I'm not angry. I'm just confused. You've worked here for 3 years. I had no idea you could play. It's not something I talk about." David's hands were shaking. He shoved them in his pockets, I can see that. Robert moved closer, then stopped, not wanting to crowd him. "I'm sorry. You don't owe me any explanation. It's just, what you were playing just now, that was professional level, beyond professional." "Who are you?" David was quiet for a long moment. Robert could see him struggling with something, some internal debate. Finally, he let out a long breath. "I used to be a concert pianist. A long time ago, before I came here, used to be." Robert couldn't keep the surprise out of his voice. "How do you just stop being that good?" "You stop when you lose everything that mattered," David said simply. The words hung in the air between them. Robert wanted to ask more, but something in David's expression stopped him. There was a wall there, built from years of pain. Pushing against it would only make him run. So instead, Robert said, "That joke I made tonight, about marrying someone who could play the piano. I didn't mean anything by it, I know." David almost smiled. "Rich people make jokes like that all the time." "I'm not always rich people," Robert said, surprising himself. "Sometimes I'm just someone who says stupid things at parties because I don't know what else to say." David looked at him with something that might have been understanding. "Why buy a piano if you don't play?" "Same reason I bought this whole mansion, probably. It seemed like the thing to do. Fill up the empty spaces with expensive things." Robert walked over to the piano and ran his hand along its edge. "My marriage ended 5 years ago. No kids, just 2 people who realized they didn't actually know each other. Since then, I've been going through the motions, building the company, making money, hosting parties for charity. But it all feels hollow, you know? Like I'm playing a part in someone else's life." He didn't know why he was telling this stranger these things. Maybe because it was late and he was tired of pretending. Maybe because David had just shared something vulnerable. Even if it was only through music. "I know exactly what you mean," David said quietly. They stood there in the silence. 2 men who'd become experts at hiding their loneliness. The moonlight came through the windows, casting long shadows across the ballroom floor. "Can I ask you something?" Robert said finally. "Why tonight? Why play now after all this time?" David was quiet for so long that Robert thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I heard your joke. About marrying someone who could play, and something about it just broke through all the walls I've been building. Maybe I was tired of running. Maybe I just missed it too much. I don't know. What happened to you?" Robert asked gently. "You don't have to tell me. But something did, didn't it?" David looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Then he started talking. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. He told Robert about the competitions and the performances, about Lisa and Sophie, about the accident that took them both, about the injury to his hand and the way his whole world collapsed in the span of a single afternoon. Robert listened without interrupting. He didn't offer empty platitudes or try to fix anything. He just listened, and somehow that was exactly what David needed. When David finished, his voice was hoarse. "So that's why I'm here, cleaning pools and fixing broken fences instead of playing Carnegie Hall. Because I couldn't be that person anymore. The person who loved music that much. It hurt too badly. And now?" Robert asked. David looked back at the piano. Now I don't know. Tonight, when I was playing for just a few minutes, I felt like myself again. The person I was before everything fell apart. I'd forgotten what that felt like. You could play again, Robert said. Professionally, I mean. You're still incredible. My hand. David held it up and Robert could see the slight tremor. It's not reliable anymore. And besides, I don't know if I'm strong enough to go back to that world. They talked until dawn started breaking through the windows, painting the ballroom in shades of pink and gold. They talked about loss and loneliness and the different ways people learn to survive. At some point, they sat down on the piano bench together, shoulders almost touching. When the first rays of sun hit the piano keys, Robert realized something had shifted between them. This wasn't just an employer and employee anymore. This was something else. Something fragile and new and potentially terrifying. Thank you, David said finally. For listening. For not judging. Thank you, Robert replied, for playing. For letting me see who you really are. They sat there as morning came, neither one quite ready to leave, both sensing that something important had just begun. The next few weeks were strange for David. Nothing changed officially. He still showed up every morning to maintain the grounds, still fixed things that broke, still did his job. But everything felt different now. Robert knew who he really was. The secret he'd been carrying for 13 years wasn't secret anymore, at least not from one person. What surprised him most was that Robert didn't push. He didn't ask David to play again, didn't bring up that night in awkward conversation, but small things changed. The ballroom door started being left open more often. The piano was always tuned, always ready. David would walk past it several times a day, and each time he felt the pull a little stronger. He started playing again at night. Just for himself when the house was quiet. Short pieces at first, simple ones that didn't challenge his damaged hand too much. But gradually he pushed himself further. His fingers remembered things his mind had tried to forget. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of avoidance. His left hand struggled with the faster passages. The tremor would kick in when he tried to play the way he used to, and frustration would wash over him. But he learned to adapt. He'd slow certain sections down, emphasize different notes, find new ways to express the music that worked around his limitations. The result wasn't perfect, but it was honest, real. One evening, about 3 weeks after that first night, David was playing when he heard footsteps. He'd gotten used to Robert listening from the hallway. Sometimes he'd see him standing in the doorway just watching quietly. They'd started acknowledging it, this unspoken ritual. Robert would nod, David would keep playing, and somehow it felt comfortable. But tonight, Robert walked into the room and sat down in one of the chairs near the piano. He didn't say anything, just listened with his eyes closed. David felt self-conscious for a moment, then let the music take over. When he finished, Robert opened his eyes. "I've been thinking," Robert said, "about what you said, about not being strong enough to go back to that world." David tensed. "Robert, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not looking for a comeback story. I'm not looking to perform again." "That's not what I meant." Robert leaned forward. "What if there was a different way? What if you could share music without the pressure of being a concert pianist? Without having to be perfect?" "I don't understand." "I've been doing research." Robert pulled out his phone and showed David some websites. There are programs that bring music education to kids who can't afford it. Kids in underprivileged areas who never get the chance to learn an instrument. They need teachers. Good teachers who understand what music can mean to someone. David stared at the screen, his heart beating faster. "You want me to teach? I want you to consider it. Not right away. Not until you're ready. But I could set up a foundation. Fund it properly. You could design the program however you wanted. No pressure, no expectations. Just sharing what you know with kids who need it." The idea settled over David like a weight. Teaching. He'd avoided it for so long because he thought it would hurt too much. But maybe that was the old him thinking. Maybe the person he was now could handle it differently. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'd have to think about it." "Of course. Take all the time you need." Robert stood up to leave, then paused. "David, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "I might not answer. That night when I made that stupid joke about marrying someone who could play the piano, did you think I was serious?" David felt his face get warm. "No, of course not. It was just a joke." "Right. A joke. Robert looked like he wanted to say more but decided against it. Good night, David. After he left, David sat at the piano for a long time, not playing, just thinking. Something had shifted in that conversation. There'd been a question underneath Robert's words, something neither of them was brave enough to say out loud yet. Over the next month, David thought about the teaching idea. He looked at the websites Robert had shown him. He imagined walking into a room full of kids who'd never touched a piano before, seeing their faces light up when they played their first notes. The thought scared him, but it also excited him in a way nothing had in years. He also couldn't stop thinking about Robert, about the way he listened when David played, like the music meant something to him, about their late-night conversations that had become more frequent, about the way his heart sped up when he heard Robert's footsteps in the hallway. David had loved Lisa with everything he had. After she died, he'd assumed that part of him was broken forever. He'd never looked at anyone else that way, never wanted to, but something about Robert got under his skin. Maybe it was because Robert understood loneliness the same way he did. Maybe it was because Robert saw all his broken pieces and didn't try to fix them. He just accepted them. One evening, Robert came to the ballroom earlier than usual. David was in the middle of a complicated piece, really pushing his left hand. He made a mistake, his fingers stumbling over each other, and he stopped abruptly, frustrated. "Don't stop," Robert said from the doorway. "I like hearing the imperfect parts, too." "It's sloppy," David said. "It's human." Robert walked over and, for the first time, sat down on the piano bench next to David, close enough that their shoulders touched.
"Can I tell you something?"
"When I listen to you play, I don't hear the mistakes. I hear someone being brave. Someone who lost everything and found the courage to try again anyway." David's breath caught. They were sitting so close he could feel the warmth coming off Robert's body. "I'm not brave. I'm terrified most of the time. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing it anyway." Robert turned to face him. "I'm scared too. I haven't let anyone really see me in 5 years. Not until that night when I found you playing, something cracked open in me. Something I'd been keeping locked up." "Robert," David said quietly, his heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that joke I made wasn't really a joke. Not anymore." Robert's hand moved to rest on the piano bench between them, inches from David's. "I'm saying that I've fallen for you. The real you. The person who plays piano at midnight and carries grief like a weight and somehow still finds reasons to keep going. I'm saying I meant it. About marrying someone who could play this piano." David felt tears building up. "You don't know what you're asking." "I'm broken, Robert. I have so much baggage." "We're all broken," Robert said gently. "I'm not looking for perfect. I'm looking for real. And you're the most real person I've ever met." "I loved my wife," David said, needing him to understand. "I loved her so much it destroyed me when she died. I don't know if I can love like that again. I don't know if I'm capable of it. I'm not asking you to love like that again. I'm asking if you could try loving differently, not as a replacement for what you lost, but as something new, something that belongs just to us." Robert's hand moved closer, his pinky finger brushing against David's. "You don't have to answer now. I just needed you to know. I needed to be honest about what I'm feeling." They sat there on the piano bench, their hands almost touching, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. David's mind was racing. Part of him wanted to run, to protect himself from the possibility of loss again. But another part, a part that had been sleeping for 13 years, was waking up. That part remembered what it felt like to want something, to hope for something. "I need time," David finally said. "This is all happening so fast. I need to think." "Take all the time you need," Robert said. "I'm not going anywhere." But he did move. Slowly, giving David plenty of time to pull away, Robert leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. It was tender and careful, full of promise and patience. Then he stood up and walked out of the ballroom, leaving David sitting at the piano with his heart racing and his whole world tilting on its axis. David sat there for a long time after Robert left. Then slowly he started to play again. This time, he played something he'd written years ago before the accident. A piece about hope and new beginnings that he'd never finished. His fingers found the melody, and this time he didn't stop when his left hand trembled. He played through it, imperfect and human and alive. And for the first time in 13 years, David let himself imagine a future that didn't hurt. David spent the next week in his own head, barely sleeping, thinking about everything Robert had said. He'd go through his daily routine in a daze, trimming hedges and checking the pool filter while his mind spun in circles. At night he'd sit at the piano, but sometimes he couldn't play. He'd just stare at the keys, paralyzed by fear and possibility in equal measure. The truth was he was terrified. Not of Robert, but of himself. Of wanting something again. Because wanting meant risking loss, and he didn't know if he could survive losing someone else he loved. On the 8th day, David did something he hadn't done in 13 years. He drove 2 hours to visit Lisa's grave. He'd avoided it all this time, unable to face it. But now he needed to go. He needed to talk to her, even if it was just in his head. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful in that careful way graveyards always are. He found the headstone easily, even after all these years. Lisa Park and Sophie Park together forever. He'd been too broken to choose those words back then. Her parents had handled everything. David sat down on the grass in front of the stone. "Hi," he said quietly, feeling foolish but needing to speak out loud. "I know I should have come sooner. I'm sorry. I just couldn't." The wind rustled through the trees. A bird sang somewhere nearby. David took a shaky breath. "I met someone," he continued. "His name is Robert. He's kind and he's lonely and he makes me feel things I thought I'd never feel again. And I'm so scared, Lisa. I'm scared that if I let myself love him, something will happen, that I'll lose him too, that the universe will punish me for trying to be happy again." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "But I'm also scared of the other thing, of spending the rest of my life hiding, of never playing music again, never letting anyone in, never taking any risks because I'm too afraid of getting hurt. That's not living. That's just existing, and I don't think you'd want that for me." He sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet, and slowly something inside him settled. Lisa was gone. Sophie was gone. Nothing would bring them back, and nothing he did or didn't do would change that. But he was still here, still alive, and maybe that meant something. "I'll always love you," he whispered. "Both of you. But I think I need to try to move forward now. I hope that's okay." When he drove back to the estate that afternoon, David felt lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying a weight he didn't even know was there, and he'd finally set it down. He found Robert in his study working on his laptop. David knocked on the open door, and Robert looked up, surprise and hope flickering across his face. "Can we talk?" David asked. "Of course." Robert closed his laptop immediately. "Come in." David walked into the room but found he couldn't sit down. He was too nervous, too full of energy that needed somewhere to go. "I've been thinking about what you said, about us." Robert waited, not pushing, just listening like he always did. "I'm broken," David said. "I have trauma and grief, and I wake up some mornings still expecting to see my family. I have good days and the bad days can be really bad. My hand doesn't work right, and I might never be the pianist I was before. I come with a lot of baggage." "Okay," Robert said quietly. "But I also think you might be right, about trying something new, about loving differently." David finally looked at him. "I went to visit Lisa's grave today. First time since the funeral. I told her about you, and I realized something. She'd want me to be happy. She'd want me to live, not just exist. And I think maybe I'm ready to try that." Robert stood up slowly, like he was afraid sudden movement might break the moment. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying yes." David's voice shook. "To the teaching program. To trying this thing between us. To all of it. I'm terrified, but I'm saying yes anyway." The smile that spread across Robert's face was like watching the sun come up. He crossed the room and stopped just in front of David. Close enough to touch, but not quite touching. "Are you sure?" "No," David admitted. "But I don't think I'll ever be completely sure about anything again. Life doesn't work that way. So I'm just going to trust this feeling and see where it goes." Robert reached up and cupped David's face gently in his hands. "I promise I'll take care of your heart. I know it's been broken before, and I'll do everything I can to keep it safe. I can't promise I won't be scared sometimes," David said. "I can't promise it'll be easy. I don't want easy," Robert said. "I want real. And you're the most real thing that's happened to me in years." They kissed then, soft and careful, both of them shaking slightly. It was nothing like kissing Lisa had been, and that was okay. This was different. A different kind of love for a different time in his life. When they pulled apart, David was crying. But they were good tears this time. "So what happens now?" David asked. Now we take it one day at a time, Robert said. We set up the music program. We figure out this relationship thing together. We make mistakes and forgive each other for them. We just live. Over the next 3 months, they did exactly that. Robert set up the foundation with David's input, and they started small. Just one afternoon program in a community center, teaching piano to 12 kids who'd never had lessons before. David was nervous that first day, but the moment he sat at the piano with an 8-year-old girl who couldn't stop grinning, something clicked into place. This was what music was supposed to be. Not perfection in a concert hall, but joy in a community center. Not flawless technique, but the pure excitement of a child playing their first scale. David found himself laughing during lessons, encouraging mistakes, celebrating small victories. He was teaching these kids about music, but they were teaching him how to feel joy again. His relationship with Robert grew slowly, carefully. They had dinner together most nights. They talked about everything and nothing. They learned each other's habits and quirks. Robert snored softly in his sleep. David couldn't function before his second cup of coffee. They fit together in small, ordinary ways that felt extraordinary, because they'd both given up on finding this. 6 months after that night in the ballroom, Robert planned something special. He asked David to come to the ballroom one evening, said he had a surprise. When David walked in, he found the room filled with candles, hundreds of them, making the space glow like something out of a dream. Robert was standing by the piano, nervous in a way David had never seen him. "I have something to ask you," Robert said. "But first I need you to play something for me." David sat down at the piano, his heart racing. He'd been working on something for weeks, a new piece he'd composed himself. It was about loss and healing, about endings and new beginnings, about learning to hope again after everything falls apart. His left hand still trembled on the harder sections, but he played through it, pouring everything he felt into the music. When he finished, he turned to find Robert kneeling beside the piano bench. "A small box in his hands. You remember that joke I made?" Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "About marrying someone who could play this piano? I meant it then, even though I didn't know it. And I mean it now, knowing exactly what I'm asking. David Park, you're brave and talented and scarred and beautiful, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" David looked at the ring, then at Robert's face, then at his own hands on the piano keys. Hands that had held his daughter, that had been broken in an accident, that had avoided music for 13 years, and that had finally found their way back home. "Yes," he said, and he meant it with his whole heart. "Yes, I'll marry you." They got married 3 months later in the ballroom, right next to the piano that had brought them together. It was small and simple, just close friends and family. David played as part of the ceremony, a short piece he'd written just for this day. His hand shook, but Robert squeezed his shoulder as he played, and that made everything okay. When the officiant pronounced them married, Robert leaned in close and whispered, "Best decision I ever made making that joke." David laughed, really laughed, and whispered back, "Best decision I ever made," proving you weren't joking. They built a life together after that. The music program grew, eventually serving hundreds of kids across 3 cities. David never performed professionally again, but he didn't need to. He'd found something better than perfection. He'd found purpose. He'd found love. He'd found a way to honor the family he'd lost while building a new future. Some mornings, David would wake up and feel the old grief settle over him like a familiar blanket. On those days, Robert would hold him and let him be sad without trying to fix it. And some evenings, Robert would get quiet and distant, lost in his own past hurts.